By the spring of 1945, the Western Front no longer behaved the way Allied commanders expected. For months, every advance into German territory had been paid for in blood. Towns were defended street by street, road junctions mined, forests booby-trapped, and river crossings turned into killing zones. That was the rhythm of the war in Europe, and no one understood it better than Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton. They had learned repeatedly that speed invited ambush and that confidence could be fatal. So when reconnaissance reports began to describe entire stretches of the German line as thin, fragmented, or simply silent, alarm bells rang. Silence in war did not mean safety. It meant preparation. It meant traps. It meant an enemy choosing the ground and waiting. When Eisenhower authorized forward movement and Patton pushed his armored columns ahead, the expectation was clear. The Germans would reveal themselves at any moment. They always did. Except this time, they didn't. Patton's vehicles rolled forward on roads that should have been under artillery fire. Bridges stood intact. Villages lay unoccupied. No anti-tank guns opened up. No infantry counterattacks followed. The deeper they went, the worse it felt. This was not how a professional army retreated. German doctrine emphasized defense in depth, delaying actions, and disciplined withdrawals. What Patton was seeing made no doctrinal sense. The absence of resistance was so complete that officers began to voice what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say aloud. Advancing like this felt reckless, exposed, vulnerable. One unexpected barrage could annihilate a column. One concealed strongpoint could cut supply lines and isolate units far beyond support. According to accounts from the period, the atmosphere inside command vehicles and staff briefings was tense rather than triumphant. The word that circulated, half in disbelief and half in warning, captured the moment precisely. This felt like suicide. For Eisenhower, the situation posed a different kind of danger. As Supreme Allied Commander, he was responsible not just for momentum, but for cohesion and control. A sudden collapse of German resistance could mean victory, or it could mean a catastrophic misread of enemy intentions. Intelligence officers struggled to reconcile field reports with what they knew of the Wehrmacht. German units were still present on paper. Orders still existed. Yet entire defensive sectors appeared to have evaporated. Eisenhower understood that if this was a feint, the consequences could be disastrous. Allied forces advancing too quickly risked outrunning their logistics, fragmenting command, and becoming vulnerable to counterattacks from reserves that had simply not revealed themselves yet. The idea that the German front had truly broken seemed almost too good to be true. Patton, meanwhile, was torn between instinct and opportunity. Speed was his weapon, and he had spent the war arguing that hesitation killed more soldiers than aggression. But even by his standards, this advance felt unnatural. He had prepared for resistance, not emptiness. Every mile gained without a fight increased both the strategic prize and the sense of exposure. To slow down risked allowing the enemy to regroup. To continue risked driving straight into an unseen trap. The paradox was inescapable. Momentum itself had become dangerous. As Allied vehicles pushed deeper into territory that should have been defended, the question was no longer whether they were winning. It was whether they were walking blindly into a moment that could undo everything they had achieved. What looked like sudden victory carried the unmistakable shape of disaster, and no one yet knew which it would be. The deeper Allied forces advanced, the more the situation defied every lesson learned since Normandy. Eisenhower and Patton had built their campaigns around an assumption that no longer held, that the German army, even in retreat, would fight to buy time. Historically, German withdrawals were methodical and lethal. Rear guards delayed advances, artillery covered choke points, and armored units struck suddenly at overextended columns. That pattern had repeated itself across France and Belgium. Now, in early 1945, it simply stopped. Roads lay open, towns surrendered without a fight. Entire defensive belts that intelligence maps still marked as active proved to be empty. For seasoned commanders, this absence of resistance was more alarming than a strong defense. It suggested intent. Someone, somewhere, was choosing not to fight. And in war, that usually meant the fight had been relocated to a place of the enemy's choosing. Staff officers began to outline worst-case scenarios. Perhaps German forces were pulling back deliberately to draw Allied armor into a narrow corridor. Perhaps reserves were being assembled behind the front for a sudden counterstroke. Perhaps this was a prelude to a desperate, concentrated defense closer to the Rhine or deeper inside Germany itself. Eisenhower's headquarters treated these possibilities seriously. Logistics officers warned that supply lines were stretching dangerously thin. Units advancing too quickly risked losing artillery support, fuel, and communications. Air cover, while dominant, could not compensate for surprise ground attacks. Patton's reputation for speed only heightened the concern. His instinct was always to press forward, to exploit any weakness before it could be corrected. But this time, even he sensed that speed alone might be playing into enemy hands. The silence ahead was not reassuring. It felt staged. The psychological pressure of advancing without opposition was intense. Soldiers were trained to respond to fire, not its absence. Columns moved forward with weapons ready, eyes scanning hedgerows, rooftops, and tree lines for signs of life. Every bend in the road felt like the place where it would finally happen. Officers later recalled how men flinched at sudden noises, convinced the ambush had begun. Yet mile after mile passed without contact. This created a dangerous mix of tension and disbelief. Victory seemed within reach, but it did not feel earned. That imbalance made commanders cautious. Eisenhower resisted declaring a general collapse until evidence became unavoidable. He had seen too many premature assumptions end in disaster earlier in the war. For Patton, the moment tested his core beliefs. He had long argued that aggressive movement kept the enemy off balance. Now aggression was met with nothing at all. He pushed reconnaissance units ahead, probing for signs of resistance, but they returned with the same report. The Germans were gone. Not retreating under pressure. Gone. The idea that a modern army could simply dissolve in front of an advancing enemy was difficult to accept. German forces had been fanatical in defense only weeks earlier. Something fundamental had changed. The question was whether that change represented collapse or concealment. Eisenhower's caution and Patton's momentum pulled in opposite directions, but both were driven by the same fear, misreading the moment. If the Germans truly had broken, hesitation would waste an opportunity to end the war quickly. If this was a trap, recklessness could cost thousands of lives and reverse hard-won gains. The absence of gunfire forced decisions without feedback, a rare and dangerous condition in warfare. Normally, resistance clarified the situation. Here, silence obscured it. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany without meeting opposition, commanders braced for the moment when the illusion would end. They believed it was only a matter of time before the German army reappeared in force. The fact that it hadn't yet made the situation feel less like victory and more like standing on the edge of a catastrophe that simply hadn't revealed itself yet. As Allied columns continued to push eastward, evidence mounted that something far more serious than a tactical withdrawal was unfolding. Reports from reconnaissance units, intercepted communications, and captured German officers all pointed in the same direction. This was not a planned ambush. It was not a temporary regrouping. The German front in the west was disintegrating. Entire formations had ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces. Units that appeared intact on paper were, in reality, fragmented beyond recovery, cut off, undersupplied, and leaderless. Desertion was widespread. Command authority had collapsed. Eisenhower began to grasp the scale of what was happening, and it was more alarming than any trap. The Wehrmacht was no longer executing a controlled retreat. It was unraveling. For a military system built on discipline and centralized control, this kind of breakdown was catastrophic. The silence that had felt so dangerous now took on a different meaning. It was not concealment. It was absence. Patton's forward element soon confirmed what headquarters had struggled to accept. They were not slipping past German defenses. Those defenses no longer functioned. Checkpoints stood abandoned. Weapons were left behind. Vehicles were found disabled or out of fuel, their crews gone. In some areas, Allied units advanced faster than orders could be issued, simply because nothing slowed them down. This created its own danger. Speed without resistance invited chaos. Units risked outrunning their flanks and losing coordination. Eisenhower moved quickly to restore control, issuing orders to consolidate gains, secure crossings, and prevent isolated thrusts from turning into liabilities. Victory, when it arrived this suddenly, required as much discipline as battle. The fear now was not ambush, but fragmentation. Allied forces advancing so rapidly that they mirrored the disorder of the enemy they were replacing. The psychological shift was profound. What had felt like suicide hours earlier now felt surreal. Soldiers trained for combat found themselves occupying towns without firing a shot. Civilians emerged cautiously, unsure whether the war had truly reached its end. For commanders, the challenge became one of interpretation. Was this collapse temporary or irreversible? Eisenhower remained cautious, aware that desperation could still produce violent resistance. Yet the strategic picture was unmistakable. Germany no longer possessed the manpower, fuel, or command structure to mount a coherent defense in the West. The collapse had not been triggered by a single battle, but by cumulative exhaustion, months of attrition, relentless bombing, and the loss of experienced leadership. The Western Front had not been broken open by force alone. It had given way under its own weight. Patton, once frustrated by hesitation, now found himself restrained by necessity. His instinct was to drive forward relentlessly, but Eisenhower's concerns were valid. Unchecked advances risked accidents, friendly fire, and logistical breakdown. The war was entering its final phase, and the margin for error remained lethal. What had begun as a terrifying plunge into the unknown was transforming into an operational challenge of a different kind: how to manage victory without losing control of it. The German retreat was no longer a retreat at all. It was a collapse unfolding in real time. The realization carried its own weight. The moment Eisenhower and Patton had feared as suicide had become something else entirely, a confrontation with the speed at which modern war could simply end. Not with a final stand or dramatic surrender, but with a front that evaporated faster than anyone believed possible. The danger had not been imaginary. It had been rooted in expectation. And when that expectation failed, it forced Allied commanders to rethink what victory looked like. The German line they had driven into no longer existed. In its place was a vacuum, and the responsibility to decide how the war would conclude now rested entirely with those advancing into it. By the time Eisenhower fully accepted that the German front in the West had collapsed, the nature of command shifted once again. The danger was no longer an ambush or sudden counterattack, but the consequences of advancing too fast into a vacuum of authority. Allied forces were now moving through territory where the enemy had not merely retreated, but ceased to function as an organized force. Eisenhower understood that victory could still turn costly if discipline broke down. Roads clogged with refugees, abandoned equipment, and surrendered soldiers created confusion. Units advancing independently risked losing contact with headquarters. The absence of resistance tempted commanders to push further and faster, but Eisenhower resisted the urge to declare an open race to Berlin. He remained focused on maintaining order, protecting supply lines, and preventing unnecessary loss of life in the final weeks of the war. The speed of collapse demanded restraint as much as aggression. Patton, meanwhile, confronted a paradox few commanders ever face. His lifelong doctrine of relentless pressure had been validated to an almost absurd degree. The enemy had not only failed to stop him, it had vanished. Yet Patton recognized the danger of uncontrolled momentum. Vehicles broke down from overuse. Fuel shortages loomed. Communications lagged behind rapidly advancing units. Even in victory, the battlefield remained lethal. Accidents, misfires, and exhaustion took lives without the presence of an enemy. Patton adjusted his approach, consolidating gains and securing territory rather than racing blindly ahead. The instinct that had once driven him forward now required discipline to hold back. The war was ending, but it was not yet finished. The broader implications of the collapse became clear as Allied forces reached deeper into Germany. The speed of the advance accelerated political consequences. Territory taken by Western allies would shape post-war borders and influence. Eisenhower was acutely aware that every mile gained mattered beyond the battlefield. Decisions made in these final weeks would determine zones of occupation and the balance of power in Europe. The collapse of German resistance removed one uncertainty while introducing another: how far to advance, and at what cost, before coordination with Allied partners became impossible. The absence of gunfire did not mean the absence of risk. It meant the war's final phase had shifted from combat to control. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience remained disorienting. Training had prepared them for resistance, not surrender on such a scale. German troops emerged in small groups, weapons discarded, offering no fight. Civilians reacted with a mixture of fear, relief, and resignation. The war that had consumed Europe for 6 years was ending not with a dramatic climax, but with exhaustion. Eisenhower and Patton, once braced for catastrophe, now faced the responsibility of managing an ending that arrived faster than expected. What had felt like suicide became something else entirely. A moment when the enemy collapsed before the final blow could even be delivered. The silence that once inspired dread now signaled conclusion. The German line had not been breached. It had dissolved. For Eisenhower, the lesson was enduring. Victory could arrive not only through decisive battle, but through the cumulative weight of pressure applied over time. For Patton, the moment confirmed that speed, when paired with overwhelming force and sustained attrition, could break even the most disciplined enemy. Yet both men understood that history would remember not the fear of those first empty miles, but the responsibility that followed. Driving into nothing had not been suicide. It had been the threshold of the war's end, and the beginning of the peace they would soon be tasked with securing. In retrospect, the moment Eisenhower and Patton drove into what they believed might be a death trap marked a decisive psychological break in the war in Western Europe. The fear that had accompanied those first unopposed advances was not misplaced. It was rooted in years of experience where optimism often preceded disaster. But when the expected ambush never came, it forced Allied command to confront a reality more consequential than any trap. The German army in the West was finished as a fighting force. What remained were fragments, isolated units, exhausted soldiers, and a command structure that no longer functioned. Eisenhower understood that this collapse did not diminish the importance of caution. On the contrary, it heightened it. Wars had been lost in their final moments before. His priority shifted fully to controlling the endgame, securing territory, managing surrender, and preventing chaos as the Third Reich disintegrated. The advance that once felt suicidal had become the final proof that Germany no longer had the capacity to resist. For Patton, the realization carried a different weight. He had built his career on the belief that relentless pressure broke enemies faster than cautious maneuver. In this case, history appeared to prove him right, but not in the way he had expected. The German collapse was not the result of a single bold thrust or dramatic battle. It was the outcome of sustained attrition, broken logistics, and loss of morale that no last-minute maneuver could reverse. Patton's dash into the German interior became legendary, not because of resistance but because of its absence. The danger he had accepted turned out to be real, just not in the way anyone anticipated. He had been prepared to gamble lives against enemy fire. Instead, he found himself navigating the risks of victory without opposition, an unfamiliar and equally complex challenge. The silence that once suggested suicide ultimately revealed the truth about modern warfare at its breaking point. Armies did not always collapse in spectacular fashion. Sometimes they simply stopped existing. Eisenhower and Patton's advance exposed that reality in the starkest possible terms. What they encountered was not a battlefield, but a vacuum left behind by exhaustion and defeat. That moment reshaped Allied understanding of how wars end. Not with a final stand, but with a sudden, unsettling absence of resistance that forces commanders to question everything they thought they knew. The shock of that realization lingered long after the shooting stopped. "This is suicide" had been a rational fear, born of experience and discipline. It was the correct response to uncertainty in war. But when the fear proved unfounded, it marked the precise instant the balance tipped from conflict to collapse. Eisenhower and Patton did not walk into death. They walked into the end. And in doing so, they crossed the invisible line between fighting a war and inheriting its consequences. The German line was gone. The danger was over. What remained was the responsibility of victory, and the knowledge that even the most terrifying moments of war can, without warning, become the moment everything changes.